Or any kind of context. I thought instead what we do is we just look at this verse as a standalone. Text 5. Text 5, and let's just explore this verse on its own. It's one of those verses in the Gita that is it lends itself well to an independent analysis. Chapter 6, text 5. It's one of these verses that responds really well to just being looked at almost in a vacuum, independent of the rest of the text. In general, I don't favor that approach, but this verse is anyway. It's interesting. Udaret atmanatmanam na atmanam avasadayet atmaeva hi atmano bandhur atmaeva ripur atmana. So the word atma is used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in the verse. So the word Atma is a simple reflexive pronoun that means oneself. So if we use it like that, one should uplift oneself by oneself and not degrade oneself. The self is the friend of the self and also the enemy of the self. So now Atma can mean oneself, like I myself. But it can also mean self, S-E-L-F. Meaning, if you look at a philosophy, philosophies have automatically, what is a philosophy? A philosophy is an attempt to systematically explain and find meaning in what is in the world. Philosophy, traditionally philosophy was made up of cosmology, where did everything come from, ontology, what fundamentally exists, epistemology, how do you know something's true, and aesthetics, what is valuable, what's worth pursuing. And so when you look at a philosophy, what are you doing? You're trying to sort of systematically explain the fundamental nature of reality, what is. And we are, and therefore any philosophy has to contain a concept of self. Now, if you want to go with the standard atheistic vision of the world, it's a number of concepts woven together. If you were to look at, let's say, a general garden variety atheism, it would be that the world was created by a big bang, and then abiogenesis, life came from chemicals, and then natural selection, random genetic mutations, resulted in some permutations creating a higher likelihood of survival amongst organisms, and those were favored, and you have the origin of species over time. So you've got evolution, but evolution is ultimately based on this idea of abiogenesis, of life coming from chemicals, which is then based on the idea of a Big Bang, with the creation of the universe. If you want to say, and so the real debate isn't really with evolution, or even with the Big Bang. The real debate between a theist and an atheist, because theism is totally compatible with the Big Bang theory, and theism is also totally compatible with a theory of evolution. What's not compatible with theism would be the idea that we are nothing more than chemicals. And so this chemical origin of life, what used to be called chemical evolution, which is now called abiogenesis, that life came from chemicals. So you got, physics, strong and weak nuclear force, gravity, electromagnetism, the fundamental forces of physics combined with the fundamental particles of physics, things like neutrinos and bosons and gluons. They form, the basics of everything that exists. They're the fundamental particulates, the most fundamental particles of existence, and those fundamental particles are governed by fundamental laws. You mix those two things together, physics, and physics gives rise to the world of chemistry. And the world of chemistry gives rise to the world of biology. And the world of biology is the world that we're living in, a world with living things. So if you were going to say that we are nothing more than chemicals, electrochemical reactions going off in the brain, then you have to come up with an explanation of how the organic, simple, conscious experience that a human being has came about from simpler chemical states. You have to be able to explain how, when a number of chemicals interact together, then what emerges out of that is a coherent, singular, unified consciousness. And that has never been explained. They've been able to find neural correlates to various types of thought. Somebody can think something and then you can look at how their brain is moving. But proving a relationship between your consciousness and the brain, which facilitates it, is much different than proving that chemical states cause consciousness. Consciousness has a number of what would seem to be irreducible features. Free will, a sense of past and present, things that we don't find exist in the chemical world in any laboratory experiments that we've done. We, of course, haven't been able to create life from chemicals. We can test tube stuff. We can borrow an ovum and a sperm, for example, and we can mix them together in an artificial womb and create a test tube baby. We can take genetic material and we can propagate life from pre-existing genetic material. But that's much different than creating life from chemicals, something which has never been done. We've never created life from chemicals, any life whatsoever. And so the idea that life came from chemicals is very much a theory. It has not been demonstrated. We might call it a hypothesis. I don't think it even warrants being called a theory as yet. It's an idea. And it does seem that consciousness is different than matter. Therefore, I would argue that the idea that consciousness is nothing more than complicated material states, complicated chemical states, I would argue that the burden of evidence would go towards the person who's making the argument that life is nothing more than a combination of chemicals, because it does seem pretty straightforwardly that we are more than just a bunch of chemical reactions. It does seem that we are more than just a bunch of chemical reactions going on. So if I want to introduce a new idea, like for instance, let's say I want to argue that God existed, the burden of proof would be on me. Theists may not like this, but I'm arguing for something which isn't self-evident. It's not obvious. It doesn't have any of the hallmarks of foundationalism. It's not incorrigible or self-evident or empirically verifiable. And so I'm introducing this new idea that God exists. And so the burden of evidence would be on me to provide evidence for them. Because when you walk around, God's not in front of you, talking to you as an undeniable facet of reality. Alternatively, if I want to argue that Howard does not exist, Howard's sitting there, the burden of proof's on me, because Howard's right here in front of us, and he's just like we are, and he seems to exist, and he seems to be right there, right alongside us. And so I want to point out that Howard is some sort of collective, hypnotic, feature of our joined imagination. The burden of proof's on me to demonstrate that, because it seems he's right there. I'm presenting that it seems, at the outset, it seems pretty obvious that life, consciousness, is distinct from matter. There's a difference between me and the bench. If you want to argue that I'm nothing more than the fancy bench with lots of more chemicals interacting, electrochemical interactions going on, great, no problem, go for it. Make that argument, but the burden of proof's on you, because it seems pretty obvious that my consciousness is different than, and actually it exists, and that the bench does not have consciousness. Now there's something called panpsychism, that every atom has some limited degree of cognition. The theory fell out of favor, but certainly somebody could argue it. But it seems pretty straightforward that the bench isn't conscious, which is why we can saw into it without thinking about it, the ethics of it. And I am, which is why you can't saw into me without thinking about the ethics of it. So, in epistemology, how you prove things, it is important to decide where the burden of evidence lies. In fact, a lot of time is spent discussing what the default position should be and who has to provide evidence. So if someone wants to say God exists, I think they have to provide evidence. If someone wants to say the soul doesn't exist, that consciousness is not an irreducible facet of reality, I think they have to provide evidence. In fact, they haven't. No one's created life from chemicals. If we did, conversation would be over. And although we've found neural correlates of consciousness, that's much different than saying we found the origin of consciousness. Much as if you ran a computer program, someone was programming a computer, you'd see things going on in the computer, but you wouldn't think that the computer now had become the operator. There's an operator and there's a computer, and the operator's using the computer. And the fact that you can see things going on within the computer doesn't indicate that the operator has now become created by the computer. Rather, there's an operator, and the operator is using the computer. And so consciousness is using the brain, but that doesn't mean that consciousness necessarily is the brain. Do you guys follow this? This is really like at the heart of what René Descartes used a few centuries ago to come up with the idea of Cartesian dualism, that there is a phenomenal world, a body world, a world of matter, and a numinous world, a world of noumen, or a world of mind. And one of the reasons he did that was because up till that point, everybody was trying to explain where consciousness and matter comes from. And that was a real problem for science. Because science, with the invention of the microscope, and other machines, was making really rapid advancement in understanding the nature of the world. But there was one area that science had a really hard time with, and that was mapping or understanding or finding the origin of consciousness. And so Descartes just broke it into two different buckets. And by doing that, really science was able to park for several centuries worrying too much about philosophy of mind, of what the mind consisted of. And by saying there's two parts of the world, there's a phenomenal world of matter and there's a numinous world of stuff, then you're able to just say, okay, well, we'll deal with that at a later date. Let's focus on this. And in fact, the Industrial Revolution came out of that. It was a huge part of the Renaissance period, was this separation. However, at some point you got to go back and you got to figure out what's going on with this mind thing and where does it come from. And in fact, over the last maybe 3-4 decades, there's been a massive resurgence of interest in philosophy of mind. After centuries of much less interest or of viewing it as two totally different branches of philosophy, now it's being brought back together, and you've got neurologists, scientists trying to now come up with what the mind ultimately consists of. And there's no solid atheistic argument for why the mind need exist. You can't trace it out from primordial states. When you look at phenomena like emergence, where the way traffic jams or swarms of bees behave, you can ultimately break it down to very, very simple movements, and then you can show how that very complicated pattern, which appears to be completely unique and almost mystical, can ultimately be broken down to very, very simple states. If you have those simple states, what you'll see arising from those simple states, very complicated patterns, which are nonetheless distillable down to these very simple states. There is nothing like that with consciousness. Consciousness is fundamentally vexing. You could explain the nature of the world of physics, Big Bang, and the idea that we're sitting around talking about the nature of reality would not, in any iteration, have to be an occurrence. Our organism could go on. In fact, being conscious in many ways makes survival less likely. Free will sometimes is very confounding to survival. It creates all sorts of existential dilemmas which may not have a survival value. But in any case, whether you argue that there's a survival value behind consciousness or not, in any case, there's no necessary feature that things had to evolve this way, and therefore you can't argue for emergence, because emergence is that you can ultimately trace out exactly how things happened, and you can't use that as an explanation for something unless you've found those precursor states and systematically proven your theory to be true. Did you guys follow that? We can explain this complex pattern of like how traffic jams happen, and how one car slows down, then another car slows down more, another car slows down more, and pretty soon becomes a traffic jam. Well, there's no reason why you would think at a glance there should be a traffic jam. Everybody just slows down a little bit. But then when you look at reaction times, each person has to slow down a little bit more than somebody else. Then traffic jams, which seem to be this really unusual feature of what happens when a bunch of cars drive down the road, why they turn into jams instead of just people driving slowly. But when you look at it and reactions and how things, people have to make an additional adjustment and this and that, and it turns into this whole thing, then all of a sudden it makes perfect sense. And you can exactly explain how traffic jams work. Therefore, although traffic jams at a glance may appear to be a very complicated phenomenon, when you look at them in more detail, they become necessary and obvious and demonstrable, and given the prior states of existence and the physical laws at work, you can 100% predict them. Did you guys follow that? There is nothing remotely resembling that in terms of predicting consciousness. Nobody's found the precursor states and then demonstrated the predictability of consciousness and shown what it's made up of. It's just a hypothesis that consciousness is material, that it's purely chemical. In 2023, in philosophy of mind, in neuroscience, it is still a hypothesis, and some of the most prominent books in the world just give up We don't have to ask why. We just have to show the neural states that accompany consciousness, and that's enough of an explanation. We don't have to bother showing where consciousness is located, how chemicals can become conscious. We have to prove conscious. We just have to be able to map the brain sufficiently, and that is a satisfying theory. But that's ridiculous. Free will, a sense of self. I mean, if you think about what it's like to be a human being, you have a 24-hour day, 7-day a week, forever, voiceover going on in your head with color, with feeling, with sensual and tactile perception, where you derive meaning from things, where you're aware of yourself and the world in which you live. You can be aware of part of your body, at the same time your whole body. You could flow backwards and forwards. And over this entire thing, there's free will. And it's the least doubtable thing in existence because it's been with you since you woke up in this world. And amazingly, everybody else seems to have it too. Although you can't prove that because consciousness is only experienced in the first person, and therefore you can't actually demonstrate that anybody else is conscious. Because science, with its third-party objective way of doing things, can't touch the subjective experience of consciousness, which is the basis of being able to objectively prove things, that you have two conscious people that can then agree on an objective set of criteria. Did you guys follow this? But that objective science of the third-party science is based on a precursor condition of subjective awareness, and another person having subjective awareness such that you can communicate with them, and consciousness is fundamentally only subjectively experienced, which makes it outside even the purview of empiricism. This gave rise to a department of philosophy called phenomenology, which is the acknowledgement that there are certain things which are fundamentally subjective, and they deserve to be studied. And so Descartes just threw it off to the side. And honestly, I think nowadays people are still largely doing that and not actually contending with what can be called the hard problem of consciousness. Not the soft problem of finding correlates, but the hard problem of why are we conscious? Why is this going on? Where do you find evidence that this is, that this is predictable in any situation? And if it's not predictable, and it's just it becomes a fundamental force of reality as opposed to something made up of other fundamental forces. Weak nuclear force causes things to decay. That's where radioactivity comes from. Why do things decay? Because of weak nuclear force. Why do atoms hold together? Because of strong nuclear force. Why do planets orbit one another? Because of gravity. You follow? You have like phenomenon, and then you find the basis of that phenomenon, and you can argue for it. So what's the basis of consciousness? If it's chemical, then you have to be able to show consciousness arising from chemicals, and in fact we can't. And so the most obvious explanation is consciousness is a fundamental facet of reality. And in fact, that's what we're postulating. That's what we're putting forward. That consciousness is a fundamental facet of reality. You have a question? Did you have a question? No? Okay. So, any philosophy, whether you're an atheist or a theist, is irrelevant. Any philosophy has to attempt a systematic explanation of what's going on. And one thing that's going on is us. Therefore, every philosophy must have a sense of self, an explanation of self. Do you follow this? There's just no way around it. Any philosophy worth its salt has to have a theory of self. Basically, it notices that us, and it attempts to explain what us is comprised of. And then where us came from. Cosmology, ontology. And it has to have some standard of evidence for why its proof should be accepted, why its argument should be accepted. And that's epistemology. These things aren't just archaic ideas about, what are the fundamental features of philosophy. Like somebody came up with a group of here are 4 features of philosophy: cosmology, epistemology, ontology, and aesthetics. Okay, but then somebody else came up with another 4, or somebody else came up with 8. It's not like that. Like in dramaturgy, you have like the 5 acts of a play. There's the introduction and the rise and the climax and the fall/return and finally the catastrophe. And then at the end of a play, and that catastrophe is also called a denouement, and it's where everything is untied. All the different threads which have come together get untied and put back into order again, and the whole thing is resolved. These are ideas within Western thought about what the fundamental nature of a drama is, or the model of a tragedy, or a 1-act play versus a 3-act play, or the Sanskrit, the Indic theory of dramaturgy, and these become different ideas about what's the essence of drama, what's the essence of what's happening in a play, for example. And different theorists can come up with different ideas. Oh, there's a hero's journey, and that's 17 facets, or it's simpler than that, or it's more complicated, or there is no hero's journey. It's an artificial imposition, a reductionist approach. So ultimately different culture, and you're butchering other cultures to make them fit into your meta myth. It doesn't actually exist. And the attempt to do this is to force structure on a phenomenon that doesn't really have that structure, and you have to butcher the actual phenomena in order to make it fit your structure. These are just debates people have. Let's say within literary theory, within dramatic theory. It's not like that with philosophy. You got to explain what is. Well, what is? What's one of the most basic things it is? Matter, the world, and you. Consciousness. Therefore, any philosophy has to explain the world and consciousness. And not only does it have to explain what is, but it also has to explain, because if you're going to ultimately understand what is, what you have to explain where it came from. Cosmology, where it all came from. In fact, the Big Bang Theory does exactly that. You have to explain what is. Okay, what is? Chemicals, which then give rise to biology. Physics, which gives rise to chemicals, gives rise to biology. But then you got this red herring, you got consciousness. Where does that come from? Where does that fit in? And you have to explain it away by showing that it derives from earlier primordial precursor states, just like molecules are made up of atoms, which are made up of subatomic particles, which are made up of subatomic particles. You can get rid of molecules because you can break them down further and further and further into their most fundamental particulate existence. Or if you get down to something and you cannot explain where it came from, and you can't explain it in terms of earlier states, then that itself becomes a fundamental particle. And so really we're just introducing consciousness as a fundamental particle of existence, as a quantum of existence. Did you guys follow this? And philosophy is not just this arbitrary idea. It's really thinking about, like, what is, where did it come from, and how do we then know what is? Theory of evidence. What's good evidence? A theory of existence, that's ontology, epistemology, ontology. And where do things come from? Cosmology. And it's actually just what anybody who's thinking about things rigorously will be forced to do. Just like wrestling. Wrestling is an attempt by a person who's standing to put someone else on the ground, to take someone off their feet. Either make them go to their hands and knees on all fours, or to sit them on their butt or their back. And if you want to knock someone down, you have to get past their periphery. Their periphery is their extremities, which will attempt to block you from putting them on the ground. So wrestling is all about flanking and getting around someone's extremities to create an angle such that you can get control of their center mass, and you can then turn them on their hands and knees or sit them down on their butt. You follow? And any wrestler anywhere in the world is going to have to flank his opponent, either maybe go below him, or come from above. They have you snap down, you come from above. A shot, you go from below. Or you flank around their arms to get an angle on them such that you can get control of their body, because they won't let you get control of their body, otherwise they'll hold you at bay. And so it might seem like, oh, wrestling is this, but if you look at the basic features of any wrestling technique in the world, any wrestling system in the world, from Mongolia to, to whatever, indigenous wrestling in Africa, wherever you go, you're going to find these same basic features must exist, because they're the fundamental structure of how human bodies move in relationship to one another. Similarly, philosophy is like that. It's quite elegant, actually. So, amazingly, the word Atma can be oneself. It can also mean self. It can also mean God, the origin of selves. It can also mean mind. And, when Descartes talked about a world of mind, he really meant a world of spirit and mind and feeling and emotion, basically everything which didn't fit into the science bucket. And so when you want to get into it, you got to start to distinguish what is your mind, what's your intelligence, are they the same, are they different? Where are your emotions? Is there a self separate from the emotions and the mind and the intelligence? Is there a fundamental self that exists once you cut through all of that? Is there a pure self? And these are the natural questions which have to be answered when you delve into a philosophy of mind. And now you're like id and ego and superego. You have different theories of mind that get put forward by different theorists. Fair enough. And those may be up for grabs. There may be benefits to one versus another. But there's certainly emotions. There's certainly thoughts. There's certainly a sense of self. You follow? Now, are there just thoughts, or is there a hierarchy within thoughts? Well, can you daydream? Yes. Does your daydream take you out of your present moment? Yeah. So it would seem yourself is not just, there's some mental process which takes you out of your daily fare and makes you wander off somewhere and you lose yourself in thought. So that would tend to indicate that your thoughts are more powerful than your body, because they just take you away from your body sometimes. Now, can you regulate your thoughts? Can you tell yourself to stop spacing out and daydreaming and to focus on the task at hand? You can. So it appears that within the thought process there's different orders. There's a hierarchy. And there's an ability to force yourself to think in a particular way. For instance, to study instead of spacing out. To focus on the task at hand instead of letting your thoughts run free. So it does appear when examining consciousness that there's a kind of just a basic thoughts and then a higher discerning level of that's above that basic thoughts where you're able to control those thoughts. And we would call that buddhi and mana, or we would call that intelligence and mind. We would make a distinction between those two. I think that's also elegant. I think that's also necessary. I think it's also natural. I think if you seriously look at the nature of our mental world, a philosophy of mind, you'll find that there is something like intelligence, the ability to discern, the ability to focus, and that there's something that's just raw thoughts and feelings. Does that make sense? Interestingly, emotions, normally we say your physical, your mental, your emotional, and your spiritual self. That's usually a common thing people talk about. There is no distinction between emotions and thoughts in Sanskrit. And I think that's because they're smarter than us. I think the idea of separating yourself into a mental world and an emotional world is inelegant. I think your emotional world is ultimately thoughts. I think that our emotions are expressed in thoughts. I think we feel a certain way and we can articulate it. I think as we're feeling a certain way, it is being articulated to us. I think that you have both impressions of emotions as well as conscious thoughts about those impressions of emotions, and that occurs as one synergistic whole. And I think the attempt to separate thoughts from emotions is awkward. I think a much better place to make a line of demarcation is between thoughts / emotions on one side and discerning, focused, voluntary, organized thought on the other. What we might sometimes call the logical mind versus the creative mind, which actually goes along with the right and left hemispheres of the brain and how thought occurs. I think that's actually a better way to think about our experience of self and our philosophy of mind. So, in this schema, your emotions and your thoughts are one bucket. They're very raw. And then more of a prefrontal cortex abstraction model. You then have your ability to logically, in a focused way, control those thoughts in order to get mental work done. Did you guys follow that? And what we're doing now is I'm starting to argue for a particular schema within a philosophy of mind, having first argued that mind or self or spirit or consciousness deserves to be treated as a fundamental quantum of existence. I'm trying to put forward a simple argument for this. Simple but not devoid of evidence. Simple but not devoid of logic. Anyway, back to this verse. Udharet, you should uplift or deliver. Atmanam atmana, you should deliver your atma by the atma. You should deliver your self by your intelligence. Now, I've already defined intelligence for you, right? What's intelligence? The word buddhi is the word I'm referring to, but that's not a definition that I think anybody can work with. What is intelligence in my schema that I've just presented to you? I just told you guys, literally in the last 2 minutes, probably 6 different times. What is intelligence?
Using your prefrontal cortex and your higher brain functioning to manage your thoughts and emotions that are on the lower functioning parts of your brain.
All right, so now we have, to understand intelligence, we are going to contrast it, right? And what are we going to contrast it to? Lower functioning. I gave 2 words for that. What are the 2 words? That's one word. And the other word? The other word? Thoughts and emotions. Work with me, guys. This wasn't very complicated. Work with me on this. You got thoughts and emotions on one side, and I made an argument that thoughts and emotions should be included in the same bucket. They should not be 2 separate buckets. And I said how I'm unusual in that regard, and I gave an argument for why. Because our emotions occur with conscious thought, and we have names for our emotions. We could talk about them, we could describe them to other people, and they don't occur as a separate reality from thought. In fact, they're part of our thoughts. They're just very unmanaged, unfocused, and just very kind of sensually experienced, low-level thoughts. Now, I contrasted that to another type of thought. What was the other type of thought? Describe it to me. You don't have to name it. Just describe to me the higher type of thought. I'm going to help you with it, but I want you to answer properly the next time I ask. The higher type of thought is more organized. I'm choosing what I want to think about. I'm focused. I'm able to study. I'm able to focus my attention on something. I'm not just caught up in having random thoughts occurring to me. I'm actually able to create a filter or a structure. I'm able to organize it and have some regulation. And I'm able to do amazing things with my thoughts by this higher process of thinking that can control the lower process of thinking / feeling. There's a higher process of thinking and focusing that controls the lower process of thinking / feeling. And I have a name for that. And the name I'm giving to that is, starts with an I. There you go. Bingo. Bingo. That's it. All right? You guys working with me here? I'm not just giving you a list of terms. I'm describing them in a way which should be intelligible to you, which should make sense to you, which should correspond to the world in which you live. Does this correspond to the world in which you live? Do you live in a world where you have lower level thoughts / emotions which are regulated by higher level thoughts / logic? You do. You live in that world, right? Do you live in that world? 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 That's pretty good. If I've just described something and all of us live in that world, then we can go, oh, that's not a bad structure. That's not a bad structure. There's a lower level thinking and a higher level thinking. We can give it Sanskrit names, buddhi and mana, no problem. And the whole thing can be called chitta. Or we can just call it lower level and higher level. We can call it kind of amygdala located thinking versus prefrontal cortex thinking. We can even start to correspond it to different areas of our brain. We can do that, but separate from all those details, there's this lower level thinking, feeling, and this higher level thinking, focusing, discerning. Right? So now let's read the verse again. One should uplift the Atma by the Atma. So what should be, now we have different meanings of the word Atma. What's one meaning of the word Atma? Self. Another meaning is oneself as a reflexive pronoun. Another meaning is mind. Another meaning is intelligence. Another meaning is God. Another meaning is spiritual self. Okay? Good. One should uplift one's Atma by the Atma. What does that mean? Tell me what that means. You. It's the first quatrain. It's the first quarter of the verse. Udharet Atmana Atmanam. One should uplift the Atma by the Atma. What does that mean? You should use your mind to uplift yourself from a lower mode of living, right? Excellent. You see how it makes sense? You should use your higher mind to uplift your lower mind. You should use your higher mind to uplift yourself. You should regulate your mind such that you can uplift yourself instead of degrade yourself. And degrading yourself would be to live a sensual existence. Now, sensual is part of our experience, but when you think of a purely sensual being, that would be like an animal. Animals have no ethics. If you go to the dog park and dog A is raping dog B, do you call the police? You don't. Maybe throw a rock at the dog, or kick it, or get in the owner's case, or whatever. Do you start thinking that dog A is a rapist, should be put in prison? Do you think like that? Or that dog then comes up and starts rubbing itself against your leg and essentially sexually assaulting you. And that's what that is, right? The sexual assault. Do you think that dog comes up and rubs your leg, rubs itself up against your leg? Do you think that dog's sexually assaulting me? I have to... No, you should kick your leg, kick the dog off your leg, give a dirty look to the owner. It shouldn't create some kind of massive breakdown because the dog is running on instinct. The dog is very much a sensual being. You follow? Devoid of the capacity for higher level thoughts such that ethics would be possible. Are you with me on this? You see what I'm saying? So when you say we should uplift ourselves from sensual life, what you really mean is a merely sensual life. A life governed merely by sensual pursuits, by instinct. by lower level thought, feeling, and no higher level consideration. Here's another one for you. Imagine there was somebody who was severely retarded. And I'm using the word retarded in its medical sense. Severely retarded. A full-grown man with the intelligence of a 2-year-old. Now, the problem with being a full-grown man with the intelligence of a 2-year-old is, yeah?
Have the bodily desires of a full-grown man with the intelligence.
You have the libido. You have the libidinous desires of a full-grown adult and the regulatory capacity of a 2-year-old, which essentially is no regulatory capacity. 2-year-olds are defecating on themselves. So now you've got a full-grown adult. You follow? But now they're assaulting you because they have lust, they have sex desire, but no capacity for controlling it. Right? You could imagine a human being that was purely a sensual being, that was devoid of any higher cognitive faculties, right? It would be a disaster. It would be a disaster. So it's funny, but sometimes you think about themes of sexual freedom get explored in art and literature, and there's this idea sometimes, this myth that that really human beings should be looking for just absolute free sexual expression. But completely unregulated sexual expression would be rape. You get it? So what we really mean is it should be completely free and fully consensual with a very high level capacity for being able to determine when something is consensual and not. A very high level of abstract thinking. So absolute, sensuality combined with this incredibly high level ability to recognize when things are consensual and when they're not. We don't actually argue for a complete return to our base existence. That would be incredibly dangerous, incredibly violent. It'd be a horrific world to live in, actually. So we should uplift ourselves by our intelligence, by our higher cognitive faculties, by our buddhi, by our ability to focus and think abstractly, by our ability to think with our prefrontal cortex. And we should uplift our self, our spiritual self, our soul, our lower self. That's obviously what the first quarter of the verse is saying. You guys following this? It's an interesting verse. It says you should uplift the Atma by the Atma and not degrade the Atma. The Atma is the friend of the Atma, and the Atma is also the enemy of the Atma. So the verse is vexing. But if we can all get on the same page and think not just in terms of a particular schema I'm introducing, but what I want to argue for is that the schema I'm introducing is the natural way to think about reality. That you already consider there's a higher level thinking and a lower level thinking / feeling. And a higher level of thinking / feeling. And so you need to use that to uplift yourself. And one should not degrade oneself. Okay, great. You should not degrade yourself. Now your thoughts and feelings are naturally degraded. That lower level is already, it's naturally degraded because it's raw. It hasn't been filtered. It hasn't been discerned. It hasn't been subjected to some ethical consideration, something which is way more abstract, an ethical consideration. I think what happens a lot of times is people have very, very shallow emotional experiences. Fear, lust, anger. They're very low-level emotions. And then what people do is they try to justify those lower-level emotions with higher-level thinking. Did you follow that? So someone is afraid and they behave in a very fear-based way, a very selfish way, a very shallow way. And then somebody calls them out on it. And then they spend a lot of time trying to justify it. And they use all this incredible, potent intelligence to justify what's ultimately a very childish emotional state. Your intelligence should not become a servant of your lower thoughts and feelings. Rather, your lower thoughts and feelings should be brought into accord with a higher level of intelligent thought. Does this make sense? Think about it. How much time do you spend defending really immature mental states with incredibly powerful, discerning, intelligent thinking to cover up the fact that you're really you're really defending the mentality of a 3-year-old. You're a 30-year-old using a 30-year-old's intelligence to defend the thoughts and feelings of a 3-year-old. Did you guys follow me? Don't degrade the self by wasting this incredible apparatus you have by doing that. Let your higher self uplift your lower self. Instead of your lower self being in charge, your higher self being employed as a servant of this lower self. You guys following this? Makes sense, doesn't it? Atmaiva hi atmano bandhu. The Atma is the friend of the Atma. Okay? What does that mean? The Atma is the friend of the Atma. Break it down for me. You have to tell me what the Atma, what does that mean? Is the friend of the Atma. So you have to tell me what both words Atma mean in this context. Howard, go. The Atma is the friend of the Atma. What does it mean?
I guess the mind can be your servant.
The mind can be a helper. The mind can be your friend. The mind can serve you well. Right?
Yes.
The mind is this like beautiful like tool we've been given. Much like your body is this incredible tool you've been given. The mind is this just amazing tool you've been given that can uplift you. You can think about things in a way that animals can't. We can deeply ponder the nature of our existence. We can ponder the greater good. We can ask ourselves questions like, what's the purpose and meaning of life? What's a life well spent? So the ability to think, higher, lower, whatever, the ability to think is this incredible asset. In fact, if we look at human beings and that we're apex predators, how are we apex predators?
Our minds.
We're not stronger. We're not more resilient. But we are the strongest thinkers on the planet. And that enables us to be incredibly weak, such that we need to wear clothes, for example, and cook our food. And yet we can make zoos and put every animal in the world into a zoo. Think about that. How powerful are we? We put a lion in a zoo so our children can look at it. Put an elephant in the zoo. We can put a saddle on an elephant and ride it. That's how powerful we are. We control any other animal. Why? Because of that. It's incredible power of thought. The mind is the friend of the self. And Admayava Ripur Atmana. And the mind is also certainly the enemy of the self. An unregulated mind is your enemy. Drags you down into all sorts of infantile sensual pursuits. A regulated mind is an incredible friend. Therefore, you should uplift yourself by that regulated, thoughtful mind and not degrade yourself by an unregulated, unthoughtful mind. You should uplift yourself by your intelligence and not degrade yourself by simply following your thoughts and feelings. The intelligence can be your friend. Your capacity to think can be your friend, but can also be your enemy, depending on how much you've developed, how much you've developed the ability to focus, how much you've developed the ability to discern, how much you've developed a value system, how much you live your life in accord with that value system. An ethic, a philosophy. One must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. Thoughts on today's class? Yeah.
Thank you for today's class. I have two thoughts. One, I really appreciate the schema that you presented of the intelligence and the mind and the way that you described it, especially with thoughts and emotions together.
It was like Freud, like with the id and the ego and the superego. He was trying to look at the people he was talking to and figure out what's really going on. So I presented a more simple model. There were only two features of my model: a lower cognitive processing and a higher cognitive processing, a more infantile experience and a more higher level reasoned experience. And I right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and more amygdala-esque processing versus prefrontal cortex processing. I gave some neural correlates to my idea, such that it wasn't just an idea with no grounding. But it's a very, very simple model. Freud had the ego and the superego to account for the other ones. He noticed some social engineering going on with the superego, and some training from predecessors that came in and was a part of yourself and became, a feature of your consciousness, was this voice of others. I don't think that's wrong, but I want to come up with the simplest system possible that allowed this verse, the brilliance of this verse, to show through. Does that make sense? Continue.
Yes, I was thinking of that in relation to dialectical behavioral therapy, and I appreciate this model much more.
When you counsel people with borderline personality disorder, or OCD for that matter, one of the things you tell them is just not to take themselves so seriously. And you train them through dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, you train them to just take themselves a whole lot less seriously. And just because they have a thought doesn't mean they need to act on it. And so within modern psychology, within modern therapeutic circles, with people with pretty onerous, significantly debilitating problems, the obsessive compulsive disorder problems, and especially within borderline personality disorder, relatively serious cluster B personality disorder, the advice that your therapist ends up giving you systematically over a long period of time is to not think you have to act on all your thoughts, and to learn to just be zen and let the thoughts wash over you, and to combat them with a higher level, deeper awareness of what's going on and what should be done, as opposed to just feeling compelled to follow your lower thoughts. Is that accurate? That's what she's referring to. Go ahead.
Yeah, I really like that. I specifically like this model better because it keeps the thoughts and emotions together, which I think is an actual flaw.
I think this whole thing of like my emotional self, my mental self, and my physical self, I think emotional and